Hello, I'm here to sort of fill out a little bit the first of the videos, I think, and to talk about the first phase of feminism. I'm dealing with the period of feminism that covers roughly the century from the French Revolution to the First World War, and it's a phase concerned with the emancipation of women and the advocacy of women's rights. I think it's quite useful to think about the terms as well, and feminism is one, the first I want to talk about. The term feminism came into use towards the end of the 19th century. It's defined, as you can see, by the Oxford English Dictionary as the advocacy of equality of the sexes and the establishment of the political, social, and economic rights of the female sex. It was used in Britain and America in the 1890s, but I think the word begins to be accepted about 100 years after what most feminists would see as its beginning. The start of feminism, as we understand it, occurs in the late 18th century in lots of ways in conjunction with the French Revolution. And it's at a time when there are new constitutions being written, when declarations of the rights of man are being promulgated, and when it becomes absolutely clear that the rights of man are sex-specific. They do not extend to women as well. Mary Wollstonecraft, who's regarded by many as the sort of one of the founding figures of Anglo-American feminism, made this very clear in her first book, called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which was written in 6 weeks of white-hot anger in 1792. And it was written as Wollstonecraft's... Something's gone wrong. No, let's go back. It was written, as Wollstonecraft's preface makes clear. The preface is addressed to one of the people involved in framing the French Constitution, and she asks the question about why it should be the case that if men are deemed to have political rights as a virtue of their humanity and particularly their capacity for reason, the last sentence makes that absolutely clear. Who made man the exclusive judge if women partake with him the gift of reason? So it's that notion that men are being given rights for qualities that women have too, but they're being denied to women, that in some ways is a sort of stimulus for 19th century feminism. And Wollstonecraft's text is a detailed elaboration of the way that the sexual difference and ideas about sexual difference conspire to deny to women any interpretation that they're reasonable, or indeed to deny them the education that makes them rational. Of course, one of the things that's obvious right throughout the 19th century, and I think it connects in a complicated way the 19th with the 20th century, is the question about what woman it is whose rights are being vindicated. Who is the woman whose rights Wollstonecraft is writing about, and who is the woman who's the subject of all the 19th century campaigns for women's rights? And by and large, it's a white woman, a European woman, and quite often also a property-owning woman. So one of the things about 19th century feminism is, while it's a demand by women for inclusion in the rights of man and in citizenship and the state, it is also in many ways exclusionary. It's talking about some women, but by no means all. So the women's movements and the feminist movements begin in the middle of the 19th century in the United States and the United Kingdom, demanding a number of different kinds of rights for women: rights to education, custody rights, rights to employment and to education, but most particularly citizenship and legal and political rights. One of the interesting things about 19th century women's movements, particularly in the mid-19th century, is they link quite closely with abolitionist movements, with movements for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of slaves. There's many reasons for this, but I mean, two main ones are quite clear. One is that the emancipation of slavery and the demand for women's rights draw on the same kind of liberal humanist sentiments. So it's quite likely there will be the same group of people who would be engaged in that. And it's interesting to note some women move from one to the other. So the American suffrage leader, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, began life as a campaigner for the abolitionist cause and turned to women's rights when she was at a convention in Britain and found that she was not able to speak from the stage as a woman. She then moved back to the United States and set up the first Women's Rights Convention. But the other thing that's important here, and the Mill quote makes that very clear, is the strong sense of similarity between the situation of women, especially married women, and of slaves. And the point that Mill is making is the way in which, on marriage, a woman gives over her legal identity to her husband. So a 19th century married woman in Britain, the United States, Australia, most other countries, a married woman has no right to any money. Either both her inheritance and her earnings belong to her husband, her body belongs to her husband, her children belong to her husband. He can imprison her for quite a lot of the 19th century to ensure the fulfillment of the domestic and sexual services. And so in that kind of way, she's deemed to be like slaves. One of the things, though, that's extraordinary here, in Mill's comment, the notion that that while women are better treated than slaves, no slave is a slave to the full extent of a wife, is that Mill seems to have no knowledge at all about the existence of black women slaves. I mean, he's doing this curious thing of comparing a black male slave with a white married woman. Now, in the 19th century, campaigns for women's rights begin in the mid-19th century, and they go on right through the 19th century, with the vote becoming more and more important. Many of the women who are involved in the suffrage campaign are very careful to ensure that their campaign is a genteel one that doesn't threaten notions of femininity. They're always having to try and influence male legislators. In some cases, they're family members, so they don't really want to shock anybody too much. In an audience like this, only pretty women would have been allowed to sit at the front if this was a suffrage movement. Anybody who looked strong-minded was always kept at the back of the hall. But of course, one of the problems about all of this, is it was very genteel, it was very continuous, and nobody took any notice of it, really. I like that one. The women who advocated women's suffrage are called suffragists, and they're very, very respectable women, as you can see, always, correctly dressed and always showing themselves off in that kind of way. There's a slight change in this in the 1890s when there's the advent of the new woman in English literature, when there's a revolt against Victorian sexual conduct and Victorian sexual modes. But the real change begins in the early 20th century with the advent of the Women's Social and Political Union, the militant campaign that's associated with Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst and their followers. Christabel Pankhurst begins this campaign in 1905 when, instead of just sort of talking at a carefully organised meeting, she interrupts a political campaign. The suffragettes believed that you had to actually take the fight to political parties and make political parties endorse women's suffrage. And Christabel Pankhurst went to a political meeting, stood up in the middle and said, "What about votes for women?" This was very shocking, I have to say, in 1905, and she was unceremoniously thrown out of the hall and handed over to a policeman at whom she spat, and who then arrested her. And she was arrested and then went to court. She made a speech from the dock. She was offered the alternative of fine or imprisonment. She chose to go to prison. And then when she came out of prison, there was a huge demonstration to welcome her. So it's kind of game on in an entirely new kind of way. Pankhurst and her followers have an absolute gift for generating publicity. Big demonstrations, carefully costumed, confrontations with the forces of law and order, and particularly courting arrest. Now, the term suffragette is coined at this time by the Daily Mail, and it's intended initially, it differentiates the suffragettes from the suffragists. It's coined initially as a way of kind of demeaning, making diminutive the little suffragettes. They're militant and they're a bit of a nuisance. But they went on to become a much bigger nuisance. Within the WSPU, amongst the suffragettes, militancy escalated. So it starts off as being involved with these political campaign speeches, but in the period from 1906 to 1913, the suffragettes move on with this into property damage, burning of letterboxes, acid burning of cricket pitches. My favourite is always the walking down Oxford Street with a little hammer in a muff and smashing shop windows. And then moving on later than that, in 1913, to arson, burning down buildings. It was always property that was damaged. They were careful not to damage people. It was also always done quite publicly, so the suffragettes who'd smash a shop window would wait afterwards to be arrested, because part of the purpose was to be arrested, go to prison, speak from the dock, and then have the whole big celebration on coming out of prison. It's interesting also that they didn't smash the windows of Selfridges, because Harry Selfridge was very clever and he supported the suffragettes. So he designed costumes for them to demonstrate in. Anyway, once women were arrested, they began to demand that they be treated as political prisoners and not as common criminals. And after about 1908, the suffragettes in prison went on hunger strikes. And this led, there's the Pankhursts. And sorry, I should have said put this one on before, but I mean that's one of the big demonstrations from prison to victory that was organised once the Pankhursts and others were released from prison. In prison, when women began hunger striking, the government decided to introduce force feeding as a way to deal with this problem. And this allows for another set of campaigns and publicity, the notion of torture in prison, a kind of suggestion that it's not entirely unlike rape, as women are forcibly held down with things inserted inside them. And this begins to show one also the kind of suffragette sense of self-sacrifice, that this is the fight for the vote is really a fight to the death. The suffragettes are very keen to show women's vulnerability, to show women as well-bred ladies actually confronting the physical and violent forces of the state. And you can see that in that kind of demonstration. Christabel Pankhurst always said suffragettes must not be dowdy, they're dressed in white, they always look very elegant, and there's a contrast always between their white clothing and the sort of rough, dark-coloured suits, particularly of policemen. So the suffragettes then are very, very dramatic. It's interesting to note that they're a very small group. The suffragettes, the WSPU is run by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. They brook no opposition. Many people don't agree with the escalation of violence that goes along with the militant campaign, and anybody who disagreed with the Pankhursts is excluded from the movement. It's run like an army. It's not a political party. It's an army, and it's there to make this particular kind of fight. What's interesting, of course, though, is that while they're a small group, they absolutely transformed the rest of the suffrage movement. The suffragettes number only a few hundred, but over 50,000 women joined the suffragists. So in Britain, in the United States, in Europe, the fact of the suffragettes kind of transforms and galvanizes the suffrage movement. Money pours in, newspapers cover the story, it becomes much, much bigger news. And the problem with it is exactly where it's going to go. And of course, all of this comes to an end with the First World War. And so that's when first wave feminism kind of ends. I think one of the things about the suffragettes that's interesting in all of this is the way in which they add a sense of urgency to the campaign with things like the demonstration of torture against women. So the suffragettes add a sense to the vote that the vote will also bring about the end of the sexual oppression of women. And they critique male sexual profligacy and the way in which male sexual profligacy brings venereal disease and infects innocent kinds of women. So they're making it a much, much more urgent kind of campaign. But while they transform the campaign and while they make it more urgent and while they give it an incredible kind of energy, it's important to note that ideologically they're not very different from their earlier feminist foremothers. The kind of vote they're talking about is still a vote for women on the same terms as men. That is to say, it's a vote for white, propertied women. And indeed, the suffragettes have very little time even for working class women, let alone for any women anywhere else. So they leave us with a movement, I suppose, a kind of legacy of an incredible kind of energy, but the need, which will be discussed by the rest of the panel, I think, the need to find a way to transform feminism from this quite closed and exclusive movement into a much more inclusive one. End.